thanks Sanchita, and thanks again to everyone for joining and taking some time on a Friday. I want to provide a little bit of an introduction to behavioral economics, and particularly focusing obviously on what we can learn from behavioral economics as designers and as researchers, and of course using some examples of the kind of work that I do with Tapestry Works. And I'm going to kind of break this down, and I know there's lots and lots of cognitive biases that get talked about. There's on Wikipedia, there's I think there's around 200 now. But I want to break behavioral economics into 5 key areas, and excuse me if and when I pause because I'm letting people in to the meeting. Number 1 is about making research simple and simplicit, particularly. So Tapestry Works, we use a lot of implicit techniques, a lot of visual tools, and one of the reasons we do that is it makes it easier for the people we're trying to understand. Second kind of theme we'll see is talking about context, social norms, and culture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about this important idea of mental availability, something that Byron Sharp talks about as well. So being aware that what people remember is generally what's most mentally available. That stuff that's very salient, that's generally has a strong emotional kind of connection. But also I'm particularly going to focus on, which I think is important in user experience, the difference between what we experience and what we remember about that experience. I think that's quite important. Fourth, we'll talk about how important personal identity is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of celebrities and influencers, and some research I've done on that, which suggests that like just having someone who's famous isn't really a good strategy for your brand. You need to think sort of more deeply about it. And then the 5th kind of area I want to talk about is the fact that I'm sorry, I'm going to mute you all, by the way. The fact that the brain is a pattern recognition machine, and so a lot of what the brain is doing is processing sensory information, looking at the symbols in the world around it, and then making decisions about what they mean and what it should do next. So let's start with being simplicit. Wendy Gordon, hopefully some of you have heard of her. She's one of my research kind of idols. Great person to read on qualitative research, but she put it quite well here. Recall, so like trying to get people to remember things, is like a search engine. It's only effective as a cue given. The capacity for recognition is infinitely greater than that for recall. And that's kind of a bit of a theme you'll see throughout this presentation, and it's a kind of theme in the work that Tapestry Work does. We try and rely much more on recognition, on helping people to remember, rather than sort of asking them to recall things that sometimes are quite difficult for them to do. Because the lesson is that if you put something in front of someone and they've experienced it before, they instinctively, intuitively know that it's right. So that's why we use a lot of visual tasks. And there's kind of 2 or 3 aspects to this. For one, it makes research simpler for participants. It actually makes it research simpler for researchers and designers as well. But more importantly, and I'll hopefully demonstrate this to you this afternoon, it gets you more truthful answers. And the process is simple. You give people the opportunity to look at lots of different pictures. When they recognize something that feels right, that's familiar, so it matches their experience, they know it and they choose it. But additionally, once they have that once they've chosen that picture and they can see it, that really helps to prompt their recall as well, so they can remember more and more of the details about that experience that are relevant. It's a very powerful way of helping people. And the first example I wanted to share with you, and apologies, I've done lots of work in Indonesia, so most of the examples I'm going to show you are in Indonesia. I've been doing some work with my partners there in Jakarta, eye to eye, on how people have been feeling during lockdown, or PSBB as it's called there. And it teaches us a lot about the power of using visuals, because typically in a lot of Asian cultures, it can be quite difficult to express feelings and emotions. And it's particularly difficult to express negative feelings. And we'll come more to that in a minute. But what we found over 2 quantitative kind of waves of research is that the level of negative sentiment among Indonesians has been very, very high. Firstly, in May, sort of in the middle of lockdown, but then even in sort of early July, when some things were opening up, and it obviously depends on where you are in Indonesia, we're seeing that the kind of balance between positive images and negative images that people are choosing is about 50-50. Now, honestly, I've done a lot of research in Indonesia and I've never seen levels of negativity that high. So this was quite a shock. What is even kind of, in a way, a little bit more disturbing is that the youngest people are those that are the most seriously impacted by the pandemic. And I've seen that kind of replicated in other countries actually as well. But so that's the kind of quantity of positive and negative sentiment. But what about the quality of those sentiments? So what I've done here is mapped the images that people are choosing onto a sort of motivational framework. And what we see is these 2 areas here of creativity and discovery, and what you might call self-expression, sort of summary. They're really, really important, and they've been becoming even more important as things have gone on. Now, typically, I mean, these are important to Indonesians, as in other research that I've found, but I've never seen them so prominent. And what is happening here is that people feel a lot of negative sentiment, as you've seen, but because of cultural norms, they've not been able to express them a lot of the time. So this need for self-expression here is like a cry for help, that I feel really bad, but I can't really talk about it because that's not acceptable. So that is a little bit of a kind of red flag in terms of, I think, mental health problems going down the road and follow up to the pandemic. But I think it's also should be a call to action for brands in the importance of providing kind of reassurance and comfort to people who are not really feeling very good about themselves. And to summarize this, and here I've included some qualitative work that we did earlier on, sort of just at the start of the lockdown. What we've seen is like quantitatively, the balance of sentiment has remained about half negative, half positive. But qualitatively, we've seen those sentiments becoming stronger and stronger. So starting from April, where people were basically a little bit bored, they felt a bit isolated because they weren't seeing their friends at work or college, and they couldn't even really sort of spend time with their neighbors. Then we move into May and they start to feel a little bit frustrated. And so this is where these needs for self-expression are coming in more strongly. And then in the most recent wave, which sort of ended sort of early July, we're starting to see very, very negative feelings around feeling trapped and growing anger. So we're seeing these emotions become more and more negative over time. Now, I realize that Jakarta's just gone back into lockdown again. So hopefully we might be able to do another round of this research in the near future and see how things have been changing. So let's talk next about social norms and context and culture. And here I want to compare 4 different cultures and look at the meaning of female beauty. And this is some work I did a couple of years ago as a validation of this visual tool, but also to sort of try and understand a little bit about how different images and also how verbal concepts worked across different cultures. So what I did was, first of all, I tested 36 concepts which map back onto this motivational framework. And first of all, as words or phrases here. And what we saw with that data is essentially the answer we get about beauty is one-dimensional. Beauty is purely about confidence, maybe a little bit also about courage and power and strength, but that's more a kind of Western cultural thing than an Asian thing. But pretty much confidence is drowning out any other differences that we see. And the rest of this really is kind of pretty much noise. But it kind of begs the question that based on what I know and based on research I've done before, I don't think beauty is just about confidence. I mean, confidence is important for sure, but it's not the only kind of thing. Secondly, therefore, does that really mean that people mean confident, or are they using that as a kind of catch-all term? And it pretty much, I think, as a standard phrase that's used in the beauty category, and we see it in lots and lots of advertising. I think that's more what's happening here. So actually, confidence here means lots of different things to lots of different women in lots of different kind of contexts. Now, when I repeat that same exercise, but with visual concepts, I get a much more kind of nuanced answer. And there are kind of really 5 key motivations that we see relating to beauty here. The same 5 are in the top 5 in every country. So that's good. So we're getting some consistency, but we're also finding actually some cultural differences. So let's look at courage. So this, like the woman in the gym, that's much more important in Western cultures. It's #1 image in Australia and the #2 image in the UK. It's much less important in Asian cultures. So this is the #5 image in Thailand and Indonesia, although in Thailand it's a little bit more popular than Indonesia. Whereas if I take this image here of kind of nature, balance, harmony, innocence, this is #1 in Thailand, #2 in Indonesia. It's the 5th most frequently chosen image in the UK and Australia. So I think there you have a key cultural difference between these 4 countries. Confidence is important, so it comes first or second in every country. But then there are another 2 motivations that come out in every country as sort of in 3rd and 4th place. And that's like this sort of idea of individual identity and freedom and the idea of fun. That's an interesting one. because it's not an area that many beauty brands explore in their marketing. And if to break this down into even more granularity, we actually sort of at roughly around the same time did some qualitative work in Indonesia on beauty routines, and actually looked at the sort of feelings people had before, during, and after different beauty routines. And here we start to see why some of these different motivations are coming to the fore. This kind of feeling able to express your individual identity, that's associated with first thing in the morning when you do your main beauty routine. And it's really important. The feeling of fun is actually associated with sort of touching up your makeup during the day. And truth be told, it's actually got nothing to do with beauty. It's actually more the goal of having a break from boredom of whatever you happen to be doing at the time. In the evening, before you go to bed, beauty goal is more about intimacy. And then we asked a sort of fourth kind of context, which was special occasions. And here we're talking much more about transformation. So this is where this sort of girl in the spotlight idea starts to come to the fore. And in Indonesia, that's associated with weddings and special occasions and parties, but it's not an everyday kind of need. So if you sum this up, you've got, yes, confidence is really important over here, and it's very, very important to women to look stunning in certain occasions, but that's not that often. Most of the time, the needs are very different. So a question I'll ask now, and we'll come back to it, is where do you think local brands and international brands are focusing their marketing in Indonesia? Is it to the natural daily needs, or is it to these sort of more formal party needs? Let's talk about mental availability, having things top of mind. And here I thought it'd be interesting to talk about the difference between what people experience and then what they remember. And this is quite an interesting discussion in Daniel Kahneman's book, rather a gruesome experiment actually, where he puts people through a rather painful procedure, but he does it in two ways. So with one group, they experience these fairly intense levels of pain, but it kind of like stops after, and I can't remember what the timing is on this, but let's say it stops after 10 minutes. Another group undergo the same procedure, but after 10 minutes, they carry on for another 10 minutes, with the pain levels gradually reducing. And what he found was, so objectively, the first experience is better than the second experience. In reality, people's memory of the second experience is much better than the memory of the first experience. And the reason is that this peak end rule that Kahneman talks about, the things that people remember from an experience are where they had the most intense kind of experience, and then how they felt at the end. And there's the third areas where how they felt at the start, by the way. But this kind of, what they take away and remember is pretty dependent on this kind of peak or kind of most intense experience, and then how they feel at the end. But their perception of time is not very good. So we don't remember how long something lasts. We do remember how we felt when it was at its best or worst, and how we felt at the end. Now, this is quite important, I think, to remember when you're doing research on user experience, because the experience in itself is important to get right, of course, but what's going to impact consumers, customers' future decisions is not really what they experience, but more what they remember from that experience. So sort of show you a little bit of a quick case study on airline lounge design, which touches on these points. And this was work done a few years ago for Cathay Pacific when they were redesigning their lounges in Hong Kong airport. And they wanted to strengthen their sensory signature. And I'll show you the sensory audit that was based on in a minute. They then did some qualitative work, and we looked at customer experience and then benchmarked it against other forms of hospitality. So we had some ideas of what kind of expectations were. And then what we did more quantitatively, we collected data from some of their frequent flyers on what they wanted from the lounge, it's sort of in advance. So that was done through a community, an insight community. And then people who were interested downloaded an app, and the next time they were in one of the lounges, they got a short questionnaire on their mobile phone to fill in about the experience, touching on the emotional needs, touching on the sensory experience, and then the positive and negative aspects of that particularly. And so the reason Cathay wanted to do this is when we did a sensory audit, and remember this is a few years ago, their main competitor is Singapore Airlines. And Singapore Airlines, if you look across the sort of sensory experience, the way that they use symbolism and the storytelling aspects of the brand, were doing much better than Cathay Pacific. And they felt the biggest opportunity for them was in this area of sensory experience and sensory touch points. So here's kind of what we found. The ideal lounge is this green line. When they actually went into the lounge, what they experienced was this purple line. And you can see there's kind of two or three big gaps. One is here. So the experience, although the overall shape is pretty similar, by the way, I should acknowledge, but they were delivering a bit too much on these kind of areas of control and order. And that's because, you know, the design was generally a little bit rigid, and you'll have seen this in a few airline lounges if you've flown. Rows of chairs which look exactly the same and so on. Where they were lacking was in these areas of self-expression and here on intimacy. And what we found by tying up this sort of sensory data with the motivational data was that the areas of self-expression were mostly about just trying to create a slightly more customized feel to the design. So furniture and fittings, design of space, pictures and decorations, so just making it feel like each individual kind of seat or place was a little bit different, and it wasn't just like everything was the same. And then in this area of intimacy, there were two issues. One was the sort of ambient noise, where there were a few things they could do in terms of design, but also this kind of need for more customized food and beverage, a more sort of individual choice. And this is where they decided to go for sort of like a peak experience, if you will. And this is when they introduced the customized noodle bar, where you can go up and basically have a chef make noodles to your own specification. And the subsequent research from them shows that that's something that people really remember as being a kind of peak experience. Next, let me talk about personal identity. And I'm going to give you one quick example here, and then I'll show something a little bit more detail. We'll get back to beauty. Well, in fact, they're both about beauty. Something I found fascinating when I did 2 or 3 pieces of work for P&G in Singapore, drug and pharma, and some of the research was done around Asia as well. was looking at some of the eye tracking data and also observationally as well. There's a lot of this kind of pictures on the left in these outlets, all very beautiful, pristine, maybe a little bit kind of emotionless. And what you could see on eye tracking, now we know that people are drawn to faces, and everybody looked in the direction of these faces when they kind of noticed them, but they immediately looked on because they clocked them. They saw, okay, that's not really very interesting for me, and they moved to looking for something else. So they weren't actually helping very much, but they were getting people's attention, but not their kind of interest. Maybe a better way of putting it. We found, and I've just picked this one out, but this was an item on one of the shelves with a sort of cartoony, very basic face, not like beautiful like this. But when people noticed this, as they were walking along the aisle, they stopped and they looked and they wanted to understand about this. Because this looks much more emotionally interesting. They were curious to find out what's going on here. And it got much more attention. It often got them to pick up the product and look at it and understand it. So kind of, I think interesting that, I think one of the things is being beautiful and so on doesn't really cut it necessarily. And it's more, people are more interested in things, first of all, which make them curious, but also where maybe they feel a bit more of a sense of identity. This is maybe a bit more like me. Beautiful women, maybe that's someone else, yeah. And found this as well in work I've done in Indonesia and now in Thailand as well on advertising and looking at how people feel about celebrities and influencers in advertising. And it's quite interesting. And I'll play a little bit of this ad. I'm just going to show you kind of responses quickly to two ads. And I picked, this is a L'Oreal ad.
Color-rich collection star Love Young Rose dari L'Oreal makeup designer Paris.
And I hope you saw it, but you probably got the sort of general idea of what that was about.
Color-rich.
Sorry about that. Now what we found talking to people about this ad, it's a bit serious. She's just a career woman. I mean, essentially they're saying she's not like me. And in a big no-no in Indonesia, she's not smiling. And I've been sat in the focus group a couple of times in Indonesia and heard, she looks ugly, she's not smiling. It's quite an interesting quote, but it's very Indonesian. So the responses to that were very, to go back to that split I made on the sort of context of beauty, they're up here in the very formal beauty space. Let's look at a local brand, which I think has maybe a third or more of the market now, and how this has happened to be the ad that was on TV at the time we did this research. And I won't show you all of it, but I'll just show you so you get the idea.
Hey, mau tahu kenapa Ralin dan aku suka banget sama Wardãh lip cream ini?
So I think you get the idea of that. Oops, there you go. And obviously much more positive associations with that ad. They don't find it silly or frivolous. They associate that with daytime, with harmony, and with happiness and fun. So it's very much in this space down here, which is pretty important in Indonesia, in areas of belonging. And it also gives them the impression that the product's universal, because all these different women of different types are able to use it, and they clearly get on with each other as well. So very different reaction. And again, I think a lot of this reaction is about identifying with the person in the ad as a person, as someone who might be like me. Yeah. Although there's one interesting comment here, it would be good if one of them had brown skin. And I found the same in some work we did in Thailand earlier this year, and I should acknowledge that did that with Stamina Asia here. We found that celebrities aren't always the answer, but identity is. And kind of our conclusion from the research we did here, and we did it across beauty, handphones, categories, with men and with women, but there's pretty consistent answers, is you have to think about the identity of the celebrity or the influencer, and the identity of the target, and the identity of the brand. And those three things have to kind of fit together. So we kind of like to pose these questions. What values and attributes do you want to borrow from this person? What's the cultural fit? What's the story? Is there a consistent story between the person and the brand? And final thing, which, you can't just use celebrities as attention getters. Actually, that doesn't seem to work very well. And the celebrities that worked best and got the most positive responses in advertising were those who had a long-term association with a brand. So they're essentially, they were more like a brand asset than an endorser. So again, identity, personal identity, very important. And the last part I'd like to talk about is patterns. The brain is, above all, it's a pattern recognition machine. It's looking for patterns. Even when they don't exist, we see them because it's the brain's way of kind of understanding what's going on, of extracting meaning from the world around us, and then using that information to make predictions and decisions. And at this point, I want to talk about some work I've been doing more recently firstly with a group of 17 agencies from 17 countries around the world on post-COVID trends. And more specifically then locally, I've been working with Craig Griffin on 7 kind of themes that we've identified, which is more specific to Asia, in terms of what the impact of COVID in the long term will be on brands. And one of those is that every brand is now a healthcare brand. And I mean every brand in every category. What does that mean? Well, it means you need to be thinking about hygiene as a kind of basic function of brands. I mean, of course, in the case of Lazada, that would be things like contactless delivery and contactless payment and so on. But I think it goes beyond that in terms of how brands, how packs, how advertising is communicating that idea of health and safety and hygiene. And we did some semiotics work. We did it across the whole of Southeast Asia. So we looked at, in no particular order, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and looked across a number of different categories as well. And we identified these 10 kind of codes or themes that we could find, which were sort of cut across lots of different categories. And I'm going to show you a couple of them quickly. So one that's pretty common is simplicity, or you could call purity, where you have these very simple designs, no frills, clear packaging, transparency, sometimes a bit childlike, white colors. And what we saw this across the antiseptic, feminine hygiene, hand sanitizers, laundry, so pretty much across a lot of different hygiene categories. One that's very different is this metaphor of warfare. And you see that that's actually tends to be more visual than verbal a lot of the time, where you've got brand names like attack, against. You have this language of war, so kills 99% of X. But you also see movement, brightness, flashes to sort of trying to convey intensity and energy, and quite a lot of red color as well. And we found that again in antiseptic, hand sanitizers, laundry, and also actually in oral care. Now, I think there's lessons here for brands even outside these categories that we looked at in terms of how you can provide reassurance that your product is hygienic, because that's a big concern from consumers at the minute. It's very top of mind, to go back to one of our themes. And what we've seen is that the codes that we see are actually evolving and changing. I mean, most specifically, just during the last few months, because we've all been using more hygiene stuff, more antiseptics and hand sanitizers in particular, the codes that they use have become maybe a little bit more top of mind for us. And as I mentioned, this is one of 7 themes that we've identified. We've put a load of information on them together on this website, culture.kitchen. The themes are sort of around what you could consider brand trust, sustainability, simple pleasures, holistic health, people going local, sort of like this paradox between personalization and privacy, and something you'll be very aware of, which is accelerating digitalization. So you can download this book, which gets in much more detail on some of this stuff, at the website, or just email me. I'd be happy to share it. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say. So maybe pick on 5 key takeouts for you. The first is really, I think, something we all need to do, just to try and make any kind of interactions with consumers as simple as possible for them. Let's not make it difficult for them to share their thinking, their feeling, their experiences. And I think one of the tricks for that is thinking about recognition before recall. Understand context and social norms, and don't just rely on what people tell you. I think we, as user experience people, you'll understand that more than most. You can only measure what is mentally available. So in many cases, that's what people remember, but that's not the same as what they experience. So that's a good thing to sort of always keep in your mind. Buying behavior depends a lot on personal identity. And one thing I've found a consistent theme in a lot of the work I do is that demographics are often not very useful in helping us segment people. Values are far more useful because they transcend demographics. You could be old, young, whatever. It's the values that's the common, the thing you share with other people. And I think research needs to get more savvy on semiotics and culture analysis, because a lot of what shapes categories is the patterns that are out there, what people see, what the symbols and the meanings they extract from them. So that's, I think, again, something we should be doing more and more of in research. And with that,